Well, good afternoon. If you are in the eastern part of the United States or South America or Central America, good morning if you're in points further west. Good evening if you are in Europe, in Africa. And greetings, as always, and love to our beloved ones in Ukraine. Please stay strong, be yourselves. And special good evening to listeners all over Asia. Um, my guest tonight joins me from Nepal, which I believe makes him the most elevated of all my guests that I've had in the 2.5 years of Fred Plotkin on Fridays. Manoj Gautam is in Kathmandu. As listeners know, I tend to invite people who inspire me. Typically, these are people I've watched for a long time. They're often people I know. In the case of Manoj, I saw him a few months ago on the BBC, and I just thought, this man has so much that I believe in, that he expresses so beautifully well. I have a feeling that he and I will have a lot to share and dialogue about. And I just decided to have Manoj Gautam join me, having never met him or discussed or conversed with him, because he is incredibly inspiring to me. So Manoj, welcome for starters. And I did a little bit of research. I did not want to do too much research because I looked up your name. And Gautam apparently is of Buddhist origin, and it means one who has the most light. And that to me perfectly is emblematic of the person that I think I perceived. Am I on the right track, Manoj?
Well, the name itself is, it's quite flattering. But yeah, I mean, we grew up being blessed with the ideology and philosophy, that Buddha tried to carry and like spread around. And anybody here in Nepal, because as you might know, Buddha was born in Nepal, so there's that as well. And yeah, like all of our lives are touched with the Buddhist philosophy. And I mean, there are major two religions are Buddhism and Nepal is now a secular country, and like one of the real model country, you could say, where religious harmony really is a solid thing. But Hinduism and Buddhism are the two major things. So yeah, but then
So let me tell listeners a bit about the person that I spotted on the BBC. And in the telling, I think I'm going to reveal more about myself than listeners have come to know. But when I saw you, you just happened to strike deep into chords, to use a musical term, that are fundamental to me that most people I never hear talk about. And that's what really grabbed me. You are a conservationist, I think, is, if I were to use one word, it would be that. The concept of conservation often means making choices and decisions, and difficult decisions, Solomonic decisions, where we sometimes have to take something that is a tough decision, but make it work for people and for animals and for the environment and for sustainability and for agriculture and for the intangibles. And where, frankly, I was very struck by you comes in the intangibles, and that's what I'm going to get to in a bit. But the BBC had a program about tiger conservation, very specifically in Nepal, and how tigers, who are beautiful creatures, but they're threatened creatures. This, by the way, for people who follow Chinese astrology, is the year of the water tiger. And tigers are threatened, water is very much threatened. And it seemed the ideal time to talk to you about these and other issues. The documentary depicted tigers basically coming into places where human beings live in Nepal, and how one wants to protect them, but also one does not want to be eaten by a tiger or killed by a tiger, as does happen. And the tiger is an endangered species. It happens to be one of the most beautiful and charismatic animals of all. So therefore, it has its defenders in ways that, ugly little rodents don't necessarily. But would you talk about your growing up and your awareness of tigers and their presence in your life? And did you see them in the wild? Were they contained in cages? How did you first interact with tigers?
Well, first of all, let me take the opportunity to commend you, and this is like sincere honesty from my side, that I've never heard anybody articulate the idea of conservation to that precision and to that accuracy and like the wholesomeness, the comprehensiveness, the way you just articulated in a few lines. So kudos, like coming from someone who's not primarily a conservationist, because I find it difficult in my line of work to make that understand to many people, circle of people who are actually primarily conservationists and are supposed to be experts. So yeah.
Well, I will say there are aspects of me, because we've never met, that you don't know, that most people don't see, but this definition came out of a lifetime of not only experience, I'm not a conservationist, but of belief and of prioritizing things. I mean, just to give one very quick example, I have never learned to operate a car, and I don't drive, because even as a very small child, I had a sense about the environment and the larger world, even though I live in a big city, that said I need to make tough choices if I want the planet to live after I do. And this comes in part from my reading of Native American stories about that the earth is our mother, and we're here as guardians, and then we pass it on. And I embrace that completely. But anyway, thank you for the compliment, and go back to your tigers.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very agrarian, like a rural setup. The kind of things that you now get to see in movies or some old documentaries about Africa or any third world country, kids running around naked feet. That used to be us, basically. Back in our time. It's the largest valley in the Midwestern part of the country. And the place is called Dang, which later on, earned this reputation for being the Maoist insurgency hotbed, but that's a whole another story. And being this large valley, it was a very, like with arable land. So Dang was one of the, like more heavily populated areas, comparatively speaking, of course. So there were no that sort of heavy forest nearby that hosted tigers, but tigers were always part of our the stories that we were told about. And my own grandfather, who used to be the pool of stories for us, like we would always nag him for more stories. And there used to be many tiger stories, his own personal real life stories, his encounters tigers, and so on and so forth. So that they were always, even way before we could actually like comprehend what actually tiger is. And for many people, I must highlight this, unless and until you've actually really seen a tiger in the wilderness, you don't know what tigers are. You think you do, but it's not the same thing that you see in the zoos or anywhere else. That took many more years for me, before I got that opportunity. But I started early on in the field of conservation, because that interest on animals, it wasn't just tigers, it was basically all different sorts of animals that I've worked with in my time. It started early on, and when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my father was running a charity school in this village, promoting education, the value of education, and very progressive, by the way, back in those days. Because and another thing that I was blessed with was my father was probably only like one among very few people in the entire area who had manageable communication, English language communication. So all the foreigner volunteers, like VSO volunteers, Peace Corps volunteers from the States, Aussie Aid volunteers, CEDA volunteers from Canada used to, somehow tumble, and they had to meet my dad, because he was also, local leader who had idea about development, and these kind of things. And they would end up seeing our house, which was relatively, better set up, basically, with lots of trees in the garden, big glass windows, something that was unique back in those days. And they would just end up asking, like renting our house. So, that there was that kind of influence as well. And they would bring different books because they could already see that that love for nature that I had, even, as a little kid. And one of the things that happened was one of my dad's friend, who comes from New York, actually, John Simon. He used to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And when he saw that initiative for my dad, that this charity school that my dad had set up, he goes back, he finishes his tenure as Peace Corps volunteer. He goes back to New York and makes this book donation possible. And it's really sad that this book donating agency doesn't exist anymore. But I think it was called Darien Book Aid or something like that, because I still have that memory of the stamps on the book. And there were a few boxes of books that were that eventually somehow ended up there. And I used to get fascinated looking at those books, because our books used to be bland as anything, just black and white, very plain, boring books. Whereas these books, like there used to be pictures of little kids, playing with rocks, trying to figure it out and doing other experiments. And one of the chapters in one of those books was about Jane Goodall. Yeah. So there was, Jane Goodall in the background with 5, 6 chimpanzees in the foreground. And, she was there, sat taking some notes. And that picture just became life-changing thing for me. And then I couldn't read back, I was 6 or something like that, but I couldn't read all of it. So I don't remember who exactly, but I took somebody's help. And they told me that, like, she does this. And that was the first exposure, from where I came. And because it was, an isolated little village, that became the first validation to this idea that I could be doing the same, and I wasn't crazy for wanting to do something similar. And not only that, it was a valid, solid thing to do, but it is a reputable thing as well. Why else would people be reading about Jane Goodall in the book otherwise? And then, that time onwards, I always try to follow Jane. There were not that many memes. We did not have any, international TV channels. It came like years later, but somehow I just, managed. I just kept that fire going, and then ended up writing my, first ever email to Jane Goodall. Somebody else replied, of course, and then that's how everything started. So that fire was already there. That I felt necessary to tell that story, because it's such a big happening in my life. And tigers, talking about tigers were always always there through the stories. That fascination was always there. But then when I started early on working with seniors and some well-renowned scientists as well as their protege, I got this opportunity to go to make trips to national parks here and there, and also like crossing cities to cities, or from my town to any other bigger cities, which was very much necessary at times, like medical emergencies and this and that. Sometimes there were a couple of times where we spotted tiger just on the highway, just crossing the highway. I think that was the first time. I must have been like 8 years old, 8 years of age, when I first spotted a real tiger. It wasn't that up close, but we could clearly see that it was a tiger crossing the highway. That was
Did you experience that tiger as beauty, as danger, as what?
The tigers, as you can imagine, they're basically cats. They're basically like cats with remarkable, striking color. But then beyond that, there's something more regal about them. I don't know if it's the size or just like your own psyche or the perception that's built up for years and years. I don't know what does that magic, but it puts you in some different kind of awe. It's something that slaps you on your forehead and gives you goosebump, and it's very special feeling. It's not fear, because I wasn't, I don't think I've ever been put in that kind of, or I found myself in that kind of circumstance where I was really scared, of tiger's presence, proximity. These days we are more cautious because of the, incidences, that you got to hear about in the BBC documentary as well. But yeah, I mean, it's just fascination. It's just reverence, because the tigers are not only, there's ecological flagship, symbolism, but they have a lot, and not just in Chinese, but also in Hinduism, they have, real significance. They're known.
What do they mean for Hindus?
Hindus are, of course, it's power of symbol of power and justice, something that keeps the balance, tells apart for right and wrong. Just a roar is enough, to basically set things in order. It's about order as well. But also in Hindu mythology, if I can use that word, goddess Durga, who is it's like the carrier of goddess Durga. So goddess Durga rides on a tiger, and goddess Durga is the exterminator of evil, and also another goddess, Parvati, who's Lord Shiva's wife. She is a symbol of she's the goddess of prosperity as well. So tigers are seen in so many different lights. So if tiger brings prosperity, it brings order. So there's much to it. So they are also matter of reverence. It's not just in the ecological terms. So
I'm going to tell you a story, because your story reminded me of a story. Most of the people who follow my program on Adagio are music lovers. And you, because you now can access Adagio, will become a music lover, and I'll help you. One of my heroes is the composer Giuseppe Verdi, who lived from 1813 to 1901, and he helped guide Italy from being a peninsula full of individual duchies and foreign occupied lands to the nation, to the Republic of Italy. He wrote masterpiece operas. It was said of him that he loved and wept for all Italians. He was born in a very rural setting in a town between Cremona and Parma in northern Italy, on the postal road that went from Milan to Bologna. And Milan was the commercial capital in a way, or city. Bologna was the academic capital and had the medical schools. And there was publishing in both cities. And the postal road on which Verdi's family lives, they had a home where you could bring your horses, who would stay overnight, and the postal carrier would sleep upstairs in the home, because his mother was a fantastic cook. So everyone knew to stop at Verdi's home for his mother's cooking. And he, as a little boy, even though he lived completely out in the country, received visitors every day from Milan and Bologna, people going back and forth. And the postal carriers came to know that he, this intelligent little boy, wanted books. And they would bring him Shakespeare and Schiller and the Greeks. And an entire education came in these books in about 1820 that made him an autodidact out in the country, learning, getting the kind of education that books can provide that almost every other little child in that area didn't have access to at all. So it was the accident of geography and the fact that his mother was a great cook and that his father ran a farm and grew beautiful foods that were served at the family table, meant that Verdi immediately had this attachment to his land, but also the benefit of education through books. Absolutely. And so it's a similar thing. And Adagio listeners know, I think, that I'm going to begin a course on teaching on Verdi on November 2nd on, let me see if I remember, November 2nd, 9th, 16th, and 30th. That will be announced soon and people can sign up for. And so therefore, sometimes it's fate, sometimes it's openness to the fate that befalls you, often in a good way. I know very well from my own life that very early influences formed me in ways that I could not predict. And an example of that where I think I connect to you is, I don't know if you've ever seen a film or read a book called Born Free. Have you?
I have.
Okay, so it was one of the first films I was taken to as a child, and it's a story set in Kenya, a true story, of a family, British family, who live in Kenya. They are known to be conservationists, and there's a pride of lions, and one of them, the smallest, is a little cub named Elsa. And Elsa is like the house cat of the family, but she was born free, and the family want her to go out and live in the wild among lions and have cubs and so on. And the music, and this is where I became attuned to music, I think, was so inspiring and so tear-provoking that my memory of seeing Born Free is that I was in tears for the entire movie. And I remember that my parents took me and they didn't know what had happened because they thought it was a nice movie about lions. And here I was crying from the music, but also the story of Elsa, who was starving, was out in the wilderness because they made her stay out there rather than be the happy house cat.
Yeah.
And that was one of the influences, along with the fact that in the same year, off the coast of California, where I had not yet been, there was a terrible oil spill. And we saw images of sea life and animals on the shore just completely covered in petroleum and gasoline and dying. And I remember that I was so completely consumed with the story of those animals, plus reading Native American folktales. All of that happened around the same time, about 1965, when I was a little kid. And so those incidents and others put me on the path of caring about nature and wondering about nature and reading stories about nature. And my Giuseppe Verdi equivalent, although I lived in New York City, I could ask for books, but the books that I asked for related to nature, related to what we now call the environment.
Yeah.
Or ecology was a word that was used then. And this, in my food writing and study life, led to an interest in land management, in erosion, in water protection, and so on. And understanding that, yes, I could be the kind of food writer who wrote about fancy foods and so on. I cared much more about clean, healthy, safe food for everyone. I remember that we would see television commercials of people starving in India. Was at that time the place where people were starving. But now it could be Africa, it could be South America, it could be the United States. We have a lot of people starving in the United States, which is horrendous. And so my focus became egalitarian. It became about equal access to everyone. And this was formed in part by my belief in egalitarianism and equality, but seeing it in the context of land use, of food for everyone, of not wanting to buy food that is flown halfway across the earth. I don't want to eat a fish from South Africa, Argentina, or New Zealand, delicious though they may be. I want fish from the North Atlantic where I live. I will, when I eat meat, which I do infrequently, but I do, I will do it very mindfully, aware that an animal has died so that I could eat this meat. I'm not a vegetarian, but I have full respect for people who are. But all of this is informed by belief we only have one planet.
Yeah.
And you mentioned someone else, and Jane Goodall in my household is one of our patron saints. You may become another, but she's one of our patron saints. And my mother has been an active donor to Jane Goodall and her efforts for a very, very, very long time.
No.
And so that, independent of me, I didn't influence her to do that. That's her own initiative. And she is not a meat eater, by the way, my mother. And so that Jane Goodall's current book that I have here, Reason for Hope, A Spiritual Journey, is about the fact that I think in our world we see all kinds of inequality, environmental devastation, injustice.
Yeah.
And to call her book A Reason for Hope is either very naive or incredibly wise. What do you think?
Well, you just opened a, floodgate. I've hosted Jane here in Nepal for 6 times, I think, altogether, and we've done book signing of when Reasons for Hope first came, and I've been heavily involved in promoting this book in this part of the world as well. Well, I think it's the mastery of Jane Goodall is, I think, just to put it in a couple of lines, is the simplicity. How elegantly yet how comprehensibly she just puts things across, and that makes sense, that gets the message across. There's no mumbo jumbo thing there. It's very very easily understandable. It's just out there, but it still carries the weight of the message, and it's very inspiring. It enables one to think that, yeah, it's possible. And I think the title, as heavy as it may seem, and wishful as well, to be honest, I think it fits perfectly because she basically, as you know, she basically has 4 major reasons of hope, the way she has put. And one of them is the power of youth. The second is the brilliance of human mind. We've had the intellect and resourcefulness to go to the moon. So definitely, if we can channelize that, for all the needs that humanity needs and the planet needs, then there's hope. Then there's the resilience of nature, which is an amazing thing. Sometimes we, humanity, have the audacity or the hubris to interpret in a way, like, if we give nature a chance, as if but even if you see it that way, all it needs is a couple of years, and we've seen what nature's capable of. Just it'll take over. Nature never dies, basically. It's just it's just the demise of humanity. I think that's what we keep referring to about the demise of the nature to that extent, because then beyond that we can't comprehend anything. But yeah, nature is resilient. That is another solid thing. And these little nuggets of nuggets that she has basically put there are a very simple thing. There cannot be any alternative arguments, or altering arguments, contradicting arguments, because it's as straightforward as it can be. It is very inspiring as well, because these are simple. Everyone can relate to that, and that's what's really inspiring, and that's why I think the name is very fitting as well. It's very easy, simple read. And yeah, I think it's a brilliant piece. I've read so many other inspirational books. Some are really difficult to read, enjoyable, but not very easy to comprehend, especially people like me, whose English is for whom English is not the first language, and
but you speak beautiful English.
Well, I was blessed, but it came with a lot of effort as well, and let me tell you that much, because the kind of English that we were taught in our early days in school, I actually had to unlearn that and then relearn this. And this much of how I talk now it's just fairly practice. just talking to people, and listening to people, all different sort of people. And that is why there's no proper accent, I think. I don't know. I mean, now I'm more, I spend a lot of time in the UK, so there's the heavy British, at least the vocabs and the choice of words that might be a little influence. My kids, they speak very native English, proper English, and their mother is from there. So but then like I have dealt with a lot of Americans, North Americans in my time, but much of it I believe comes from watching movies and like interviews, this that as well. So I just basically picked. I was very I used to practice within myself, even sat in the toilet even like I would just create a scenario in my head. And so it took a lot of effort. But reading books sometimes can still be especially when you're tired or something like that, can still be challenging. But this particular book, but there are other Jane Goodall books, like In the Shadow of Man. Jane Goodall is gifted with that, that amazing gift of being able to get the message across, while using, in the most simplistic terms. But then this particular book is, I think, targeted for young chaps primarily. I mean, this is for everybody, but then that is a magic, that is what makes her a guru-like personality, like who has that ability to get the message across. So yeah, I think this is a brilliant book, and I recommend it always.
So I know, because they said so on the BBC, so it must be true, that you studied at Oxford, that you did a dissertation at Oxford. In which college?
I was in the most radical, most progressive ones. I was with St. Anne's.
Which one?
St. Anne's.
Oh, St. Anne's, yes, sure. Oh my.
Yeah, St. Anne's. The poor man's college, but then very progressive college at the same time.
No, for people who don't know, Oxford University is built on the college system. Yeah. I've taught at Christ Church, which is, yeah. And each one has its own very distinct personality. Absolutely. I have a cousin who studied at Balliol, and they're all very, very different. Yeah. And I've been blessed to be in Oxford a fair amount and do my own research there, but also teaching. And when you go to Oxford, it's an intoxicating environment of braininess. Yes. But at least in my experience, not necessarily a sense of self-entitlement. I think because you're surrounded by so many smart people that even if you are incredibly smart, you can't be arrogant, because everyone is there to challenge you in a friendly way. But what I have loved there is being able to stand up and speak my piece and have very learned people push right back at me and challenge which is wonderful. It's refreshing. It's exciting to have that happen. So when you were there, talk about your Oxford experience as a young man from Nepal, as a student, and how it changed your learning practices, because you were talking about how you learned English, but I think that the passions of the mind that happen in a place like Oxford are different from having people pass through your household and bring you books and that experience. Yeah, well,
I've always had this very interesting relation with the mainstream education. So, the charity school that I mentioned earlier that my dad had set up, the very first few years of my education was at that school itself, because it was just like basically a larger one block in the larger compound of my where my home, basically where I grew up. It was just basically like next door kind of setup. So I could, if I wanted to, I could just skip the class and come home and like drink a glass of milk and then go back or something like that. Mm-hmm. That sort of setup, very homely setup. And then because it was financially, my father was bleeding money, and my mom still gives him a hard time about how silly it was to not consider financial sustainability. So he couldn't carry on with it. because there was no external support coming for the school. Everything was free, like books, notebooks, and pens and pencil. Everything was free for the kids. And then my dad would actually go around rounding up people, like just harassing some parents who wouldn't, because it wasn't mandatory. Like there was no the government's presence there. Like who would be imposing these rules. Like send your kids to school. That was my dad doing that. And of course, especially if you push the parents to to send their kids, then obviously you can't charge them any fees or anything like that. So and then he bought because they were students, that it was his responsibility. So he couldn't just basically just say, okay, the school's off, so off you go. He somehow spent some bit of money and then bought this mainstream school, and we all were basically transplanted there. All the students were transplanted there, and then I used to be well, class topper was the terminology used. I used to be I was bright, I was bright, and I always cheated on homework. Like the lazy, not necessarily lazy, but the procrastinating type. I still am saying, actually, my energy system works very differently. If there's something that I find boring, then I will be the laziest person you can find in the world.
I hear you.
But then if there's something that really ticks me, then I will be relentless. Like then I'm like I can work on it tirelessly. And somehow around third grade, my teachers wanted me to jump the class, because they thought I could manage to just skip grade 4, and I was fit to go on grade 5th. My mom said no to that, because my age wise I was doing fine. Like why bring any turbulence? And it just happened that I did the first term, which was 3 months or so, in the grade 4. And then I don't know how my mom couldn't prevent that from happening, but my teachers just put me on grade 5. And that's when that disbalance started coming, because I had lost and that was the first year introduction of algebra and this and that, and my mind wasn't very because maths was all about, the entire education system was mug up. You just basically mug up and vomit during the exams. Mm-hmm. So your entire evaluation would be based on 10, 15 questions.
In effect, things that you would memorize and bring back.
Absolutely. So
rather than
rote learning.
This is something I think I've recognized in you just in our brief connection. You are a creative and critical thinker.
I do. I do happen to be that. Yeah, I have always been like that. I
can feel that
from early on, and also that dissatisfaction about the way I didn't know much about how because there were no standards to compare, and there was no exposure to the idea that this is not how education should be. Like education could be much more creative. It could be a little more experiential, and like there were different forms of different ideas about education that were that were mainstream already in other parts of the world, but at the corner of the world where I was growing up, we didn't have anything like that. But that dissatisfaction was already there, and there was a lot of frustration. And I think that's, and especially when that turbulence came, because I couldn't catch up, with all these new concepts like algebra and this and that. And I was I was a good student in more subjective matters, like that needed deep thinking rather than, and mathematics was basically just practice. And it was no fun for me. And we used to get like loads of homework, and I used to pick literature, poetry sort of thing. And I would just do one. I would only do this, and I will get punishment for not doing the rest, but I just enjoyed, I only did what I enjoyed doing. So that was the, course of my, schooling basically. And then at around 7th grade or so, I completely lost interest in it, that sort of education, because I was too distracted. I was already going out, to the jungle, rivers, spending a lot of time, and then I lobbied. I think it was when I was in 8th grade, I think, maybe it was 8th grade. I lobbied with the local cable operator to bring National Geographic, because there was no full-time National Geographic channel and Discovery Channel those days. But there was another, Star Plus, I think that was a channel. Every Saturday, they used to show National Geographic special, a 3-hour long documentary. And I used to just glue myself in front of TV with a little notebook and pen, just jotting down, taking notes. That was my life, like if there was anything that gave me unimaginable amount of energy, it was that, I wanted to be that. And what they were teaching me back in the school had nothing to do like any of that bit that kept my enthusiasm. So I started faltering, in my class, my position from the first boy school, like the school topper to just, and I was a school captain when I was in 6th grade, which was unprecedented. I was this little boy, and I was basically the school captain, which was a big honor back in those days. And I used to command in the whole thing very well. And then when I started doing badly with my academics, then I have a lot of bad memory from that time. But I was a rebel, and I just didn't care. I stopped caring about it. All my intention was focused on was to just somehow pass the exams, so I don't get stuck, because that would basically start the growth. But then like all the marks, being the first, it stopped meaning anything to me. So I was learning more from watching National Geographic and like following and being out in the field more than I believed I was learning at the school. And so such was the experience of mainstream education. And then I came to Kathmandu for high school. Same situation, basically even more, a bigger level of frustration. And then came this time when I got to join my bachelor's degree, which was 4 years, and there was one gap year. And I had done a lot during that gap year, and I think I felt like I was very ready. I was very eager to join this program, because for the first time, because everything that was general education up to this time, and now anything close to the kind of a specialization that I wanted, for the first time, the bachelor course was about environmental management. That was the closest course I could find to my interest, and I was really excited, and I did very well during the first semester. But then slowly it just turned out to be, really disappointing as well, which is why there was 10 years of gap before I even, thought of joining Oxford. Because, and that I did, like there's a very interesting story behind, like why I felt pushed to further continue further, my mainstream education, because people, the kind of work I was doing, I was getting a lot of, recognition here and there, media quotes. There was a time when from 2006 onwards till 2010, I probably was, like the nobody who was most quoted in the mainstream daily newspapers, like because we were running so many, different campaigns and so many multiple, conservation related and environmental related programs, that I was always on the, like I really did exploit media back in those days. And people used to think I was, and also, like the battle with the government officials here or there, being the rebel, like we were always pushing the boundaries against the lethargic administrative, bureaucracy and all that kind of thing. So I used to keep beard. The reason I started doing that was to look more mature, because otherwise like nobody would heed you, nobody would listen to you. That started early on. And also I had this responsibility to lead this renegade group of, it was like a guerrilla group, like there would be at least 10, 12, 13, up to 30, 35 bunch, young chaps. And, like I was in charge for fundraising for their motorbikes, snacks, mobilization for here or there, and I needed to be more, I needed to look more mature. That was the kind of mindset, that was the kind of working style as well back in those days. And people started addressing me in different, a manner. I would get invited for conference, and there would be like Dr. Manoj, and I that would make me feel less, about myself. And I thought, like, okay, this is, like just for the sake of it, if it has to be, because of the structure of the society and how people's psyche works, I have to upgrade my my academics. That was the pressure. That was the pressure trigger, actually. And then I thought of like my first attempt was Cambridge. There were some series of very, very unfortunate events which for which I still don't have any explanation. I don't understand what actually happened, but it didn't go, as expected. And then the second attempt was Oxford University, and my grades were not that good. My GPA was not good, because the 4 years of my bachelor's, I think it was second semester, I made a deal with my director. I said, listen, if you're gonna, keep on continuing with this repetitive, not practical kind of, education, then I'd rather pursue my projects and, learn from there, for which you'll have to grant me, some leeway that I don't ask for much, but don't fail me because of my attendance. There were 2 exams. One was internal exams, and internal examination considered the attendance, without which you could not pass. And the other one was the external examination. And of course you had to do, what you needed to do to pass it. And I told my director that I will pass. It's my responsibility to pass the external exams, but you have to give me that much leeway, to not fail me in the internal exams. Then I can make peace with it, or I will create a union, and then there will be protest. Or you agree with me in terms of changing or making some reforms in the curriculum, which is something I'm willing to put my however many hours it takes every week, my time as well. And he chose the first option, and he gave me the leeway to basically not worry about my attendance at the college. So that's how I had completed my undergrad. So obviously my grades were not that great. I think it was 2.74 or something like that, which was lower than the standards that they usually seek during the
Einstein failed at science, so don't worry.
No, I never did. By that time, I was so sure about the fact that I didn't, that was not what I needed. But again, I needed to pass. That was my bottom line, has always been my bottom line. And then I made that attempt on Oxford. Actually, I had already missed the deadlines for major scholarships. So I just applied without any scholarship. I just applied and got accepted. I was actually I was in the States. I was in Detroit. A very good friend of mine, Leah Juarez, and she was introducing me to her horse, actually.
Her horse or her course?
No, a horse, actually.
Okay.
She's into horse riding, and yeah, it was a beautiful day. I still remember, how they were talking that there used to be bald eagles in that area, and hadn't been seen for the past 15 years, and I spotted one the same day. So really, really special day, in my memory. And I got the message that you've been accepted, and I remember going like, uh-oh, what am I going to do now? Because I didn't have any resources. It's one thing to be accepted, but I just didn't want to bother until I was back home. And in about a week's time, I was back home, and then I got emails were waiting for me from college, St. Anne's. That's how actually I ended up going to St. Anne's as well. It said, if you want to join our college, here's this scholarship waiting for you, which wasn't we didn't cover everything, but still it was serious chunk. And then I also got a bursary without even asking for it from the university. So that's how I ended up in Oxford, without absolutely having any idea about the college systems, this and that. That was when, right? When there was a time to actually go. I was just figuring as I was moving on everything out, and then I was there. Amazing experience. Amazing.
I just want to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll continue. I first need to comment that one day you and I are going to get together over a big plate of Nepali momo, which is the dumpling typical of Nepal. Then I'll make some pasta, and you'll discover that your life's journey, your early life's journey, very similar to mine, except that I skipped third grade, but everything else along the way, and failing in mathematics, everything is identical. It's fascinating. Wow. But my question for you is, when you lived at Oxford at St. Anne's, did you hold any kind of jobs? When I was doing my education, also didn't have the funds, and I worked for a professor. I worked in the library of my university. And then I cooked for a year at McDonald's and worked in a bakery. So by night I baked, but in the late afternoons, early evenings, I cooked at McDonald's, which for me was a fascinating education about mass food and about industrial agriculture, and seeing how and where the food arrived from and what condition it arrived. And I'm saying something now McDonald's may not know. My being a rebel, I didn't prepare the burgers, the Big Macs, and so on according to their menus. I prepared them the way I thought they would taste better. And my particular store sold many, many more of these things when I was cooking, because people knew to come that somehow it tasted better because I added flavorings that McDonald's did not include. But a big part of my education was being a worker, being paid minimum wage, $2.08 an hour. And I'm not talking about ancient history, but restaurant workers had a lower wage because it was assumed we received tips and gratuities. I did not receive a tip when I was behind at the grill at McDonald's, and therefore lived on very little money. And we would feed each other at McDonald's, and I would basically make omelets for everybody because with the extra eggs, because we were starving. We were starving students. And it gave me an awareness of need. I mean, I didn't think I was going to starve to death, but I was very aware of the fact that the available food to me was industrial food. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's good industrial food, but this was food that had no flavor, had very little nutritional content, was full of salt, full of sugar, and was making people sick. But I had to structure my days in my education around my working. And at night, when I worked in a bakery, I made croissant. I learned the manual art of making food by hand, as opposed to having everything arrive frozen and prepackaged from McDonald's. So did you hold any kind of job while you were at Oxford that gave you a window into the working life of typical British people?
Actually, no. Like one interesting thing about me is I have never worked. It's not like, I've never worked for others, but I've never worked in that kind of setup. Like pretty much all my life I've taken, I've taught online classes, like early on, even when I think I was in the gap year right after the high school level. I was teaching online, at some community colleges in the US. I had contracts with some European universities, to be their chaperone when they came here for researches, this and that. Like I've taken all the different random jobs. I worked as a not political analyst per se, but something similar kind of thing back in 2010 for the Carter Center, President Jimmy Carter's initiative, as the peace process observer, peace process monitoring officer
in Nepal.
In Nepal, that is, because that was a time when Nepal was working on promulgating its new constitution after the Maoist insurgents had become mainstream, and then the peace accord was on, and we were responsible for monitoring the level of violence, the political spacing, and all that kind of thing. That was one particular time that I remember that I worked on like directly under like in a very strict job description, directly under somebody. But even then it was very like a familiar setup. We're all friends basically. There was no direct hierarchy, even though the structure was supposed to be like that, but on a practical sense it wasn't like that. So yeah, I mean, talking about Oxford, I was probably the I wouldn't call it, I wouldn't say least resourceful person, despite not having the, scholarship, like fully covered scholarship. My tuition fees were, covered from the college and, university bursary. And there were some really, generous friends, well-wishers, and I'm blessed with many. I've been very lucky. There are people around the world who look out for me, at times. Even, like when I don't know, they just find out somehow, and then like they're the ones taking
Mhm.
a couple of steps ahead of me. And then there's another like mentor of mine. I was in New York actually when we discussed, because he was supposed to help me with my business idea, which had a lot to do with conservation again. But that's what we were supposed to like be discussing on. And then I said, but this thing has to stop, be put on hold for one more year because I'm going to Oxford. And he was shocked. Why do you need to go to Oxford? You should go to Oxford to teach, not not as a student. He said he wasn't, quite happy with that idea. It's like, no, I do need that. It is for a strategic reason, but I mean, being a student has always scared me. But I'm quite looking forward to this. I need this experience. So he said, how can I help? I said, and he is a very successful, like he's incubator actually, startup incubator. One of the best in the world actually. He started in Silicon Valley. Kailing is his name. He's basically in Malaysia now. He's based out of Malaysia. He's doing the same thing. 500 Startups. He's the co-founder of 500 Startups, one of the most successful initiatives. So he chipped in, and then he said, "What's the number? Just tell a number." And then I said, I quoted like a modest number, and he was like, "You sure this is fine?" And all I had was that resource, and my wife and my kids were back in Nepal. Mm-hmm. Because my wife had a job here. Both my kids were here. And I didn't have any job then, but I had just enough to survive. But then at the same time, I was still looking after the projects, managing projects remotely, Jane Goodall Institute Nepal's projects, and some of my own independent conservation projects. So I made frequent trips. There was a conference that was I basically left in the middle of organizing one of the largest conference of its kind that Nepal had seen. Asia for Animals conference in 2017. So a lot was going on. I was going back and forth. So the resource was, like a tight thing. But then if you talk to any of my, cohort members back in Oxford, they would tell you that I lived like a prince, even though I was possibly the like the most resource constrained guy. Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting thing that I didn't feel that cornered to pick any random job there. If anything, I was actually taking some consultancy jobs on the side because I wasn't being paid. I never got paid for what I did for Jane Goodall Institute. It was absolutely willful voluntary work for 20 years. That is. Yeah, the idea of money making came really late. Which is why I'm like really working hard on setting up my own business, which is the eco the tour company and a wilderness camp in Nepal where I bring people in. It's not.
So I want to ask you. I'm aware that you were talking about your father,
mm-hmm.
but we're also talking about poverty and education, and all of this blends into an initiative that I know you worked on, that in Nepal, which is not, to my knowledge, an egalitarian society, and there is extreme poverty, that many children did not necessarily have access to schools. And you worked on a project that took the very poorest children who worked in agriculture, in servitude in houses, and doing very menial, terrible jobs that children should not be doing, to help them gain access to education. And you did this about 15 years ago, I believe, when you were yourself a very young man. You're still a young man.
Yeah.
But we're a very young man. How did you become sensitized to that? And, given your own, I'll use the word dissatisfaction with some of your education, did you try just to guarantee that these children got the basics, or that their education would in some way be different from the simple absorption of facts and then the regurgitation of facts, but instead what I referred to before, critical and creative thinking?
Yeah, very interesting question, Fred. there's a distinction. There's a sharp distinction actually between where my dissatisfaction was coming from, as a student, as a victim of the kind of education that was imposed upon, and the situation of those destitute child laborers, snatched from their homes, their parents, or sent away by their own parents in some cases, as young as 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, working, in affluent people's houses here in Kathmandu, in the capital. And child labor was, it's still, a plague, actually, if I may, but it used to be much, much worse back in those days, like 15, 16 years ago. So them not having these destitute kids, not having any access, there was no choice. I could have that, I could hold that grudge, I could have that resentment against, the kind of education that was imposed upon us, because I had the opportunity to go to school at least, But it's a whole another thing when that opportunity is not even, there. And I have seen, and I had seen this, like years and years before we created that initiative, in so many circumstances, because it was just very widespread thing that these kids as young as 7 you would see them carrying, and you would know that, like these are the destitute, like domestic child laborers, because of the, raggedy clothes and their malnutrited hair, and like just everything would be shouting testimony of of who they were, carrying school bags, water bottles, and walking behind the son of their employer or daughter of their employer, who would be, like tidily well dressed in, school uniform and this and that. And these kids, and in most cases, these kids would be older than them even.
Yeah.
And then they would basically carry the bag and walk them to, or escort, if you may, to the school gate, and then just with a blank, lost eyes, just look at the school, and basically just wave at them at the end of the day, at the end of their chore, that was to like basically drop them at to the gate, and they still stare, just basically imagining what is it that they do back there, and then come back home and work as a donkey, like just basically whether it's washing or cleaning or doing dishes, whatever it is, and they never got a chance to do anything. So that particular initiative, and this is not only something that that came to our mind then. One of the things that I was blessed with was what our father did or was doing was always right in front of our eyes, and especially as compared to my brother and my sister, I was more blessed because I was the youngest one, and when much of that was happening, I would be around, and I got along with my father very well, and he always like took me to his own initiatives, projects, whether it's coal mine kids while he was working with International Labour Organization, or working with the VSO volunteers, who would be basically running this adult literacy program. So I used to be one of the teachers when I was 7 or 8 years old, teaching how to write like first few letters to these 60, 65 years old elderlies in kerosene lantern light, because of the load shedding. And like so all these cluster of experiences that I had the opportunity to, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, but so the experience you just mentioned, like that is the best thing that I can relate to with your work experiences, being your school, and that was my true school. That was the society, the open society was a real school. But the fact that I put myself in the maximum engagement with the factors within the society early on, I got to see different aspects, different facets of life, in that regard, and also kind of grow that sense of responsibility early on, which not that many kids were receiving back in those days, and especially these days. Like my son, I try to bring that to my son, and sometimes I think like it's a selfish thing that I'm doing because I did that, but I still feel blessed, because of those opportunities that I got which is something that I believe expanded the horizon of my understanding about life and world and our society and our responsibility, more, general morals and moral obligations, and the idea of the egalitarian society that we all long for, but in this real world isn't available, which is what instigated us, because by that time I was organized enough, and I had the confidence enough to shoot for it. And let me mention this actually, because this is a really interesting project that we did with British Council, together with British Council and British Embassy here in Kathmandu. So the early 2000, I think it was late 2005 or early 2006. Me and my brother got invited. I think I had just met the country manager of British Council once before that, and for some reason we got, maybe because of the association with Jane Goodall Institute, we got invited on the first visit of the international manager of British Council, Sir David Green. And his visit was received very well received in Kathmandu. He was in media here and there, and then there was a very a closed reception, a welcome reception for Sir David Green, where the country manager, John Fry was his name. He had handpicked very few, like less than 20 people for that reception, and me and my brother happened to be, two of those people invited. And we had received this invitation letter, like a card, at the bottom of which it was mentioned that British Council registered as charity in the UK. And that was that just had done something in my mind. It just got stuck in my mind. And while we were sat with Sir David Green, he was basically just moving from people to people, just getting to know who we were, and he came to us, and we just started casual chat. And I just out of curiosity, I said, I didn't know that it was just charity. And he said, like, what do you think it was? And I said, because British Council here, you see the incoming and outgoing in the facility, you see the most affluent people, children of most affluent people, the elite circle basically just comes and goes, uses the library, uses the facility, and services as well. And the courses that they offer, they were never, cheaper than 12,000 rupees, which was back in those days probably about little more than $100, $150 or so back in those days, which was huge amount of money for general Nepalese, let alone destitutes. And I wasn't trying to be cynical or sarcastic or anything like that. It was just plain like curiosity. I asked him, and I said, "But you do business," I thought, because you charge money and you serve to the. And that was like he wasn't offended. He took it very positively, and he said, like, "What do you think British Council needs to do, for us to act more like a charity? Open your doors for the poor and destitute." That was like instant answer. And then he said, "He would love to do that. Like, have you got any ideas?" Like, absolutely. So he just hands me his card, and in a couple of hours the reception party was done. We had a lot of fun, and then both of us we drove on a motorbike and sat on the computer, wrote 2 pages long concept paper then and there. And the idea was about identifying at least few. We knew that like we couldn't cover the entire magnitude of the problem, the scale of the problem in which it existed. But to whatever extent we could, the idea was about to identify these destitutes working in other households, and then somehow to work within the psyche of the owners, employers, pretty much like owners. That's how they used to behave. Which wasn't going to be easy, but we would basically tap on the humanity sense. That was the idea, and then bring them to British Council, use their facility, use their resources, and run a very progressive style of, and not boring, the kind of things that we got, an accelerated educational package. and they bought it. It was just $3,000. It wasn't a big amount of money for the entire year, by the way.
Yeah.
It was all volunteer run, project. And I think British Council put half the money, and British Embassy, chipped in for the rest. And it was a super project, like very small scale, of course, but then that's something that I will always be proud of, the way, and I will be proud of my colleagues as well, because I set it up, it set the trend. And a very close friend of mine, Sheila Shrestha, who actually now happens to be in New York, somewhere in Queen Astoria. She quit her really good paying, job at an international school, which was like a kindergarten sort of thing. And she brought that experience from that school and sat together with us, and we devised all the whole entire curriculum and like the record keeping system and everything, and then introduced. It was start from scratch kind of thing, but then we did that, and it was the initiative was also featured in International Herald Tribune. It did well. It did well for everybody. It brought some really good recognition and comments for British Council as well. But unfortunately, on the third year, 2 years they funded it, but then the leadership changed, and then the answer, from the new leadership was that it doesn't fall under the mandate, which was quite unfortunate, actually.
So Manoj, I'm going to push you in a slightly different direction. Maybe
I could go on and on about these things.
That's okay. I think you and we have a lot to talk about in our future. One of my credos is that you live by technology, but you die by technology. And that in the most general terms, we have given ourselves over to technology. It can be miraculous. The fact that I'm sitting here in New York and you're in Kathmandu, and we can have this conversation, and people in Rio de Janeiro and Tokyo and Durban, South Africa can watch us, is a phenomenal thing, and I'm grateful for that kind of technology.
One of the reasons for hope, by the way, that I missed earlier.
Yeah, but I'm concerned about children of your children's generation, to a lesser degree, people of your generation, but your children, because they become digital natives. And I come from an experience, I'm not ancient at all, but it was always my philosophy, the fact I chose not to learn how to drive a car, the fact that I will make my pesto by hand rather than using a blender. I believe in the manual. I believe in the human touch. I believe in the senses in the extreme. I use the term about myself that I'm a pleasure activist. And what that means is not that I'm wasteful and hedonistic, although one can be, but we've been given this phenomenal gift of the five senses that most of us barely use. And I'm very in tune with my hearing, my smell, my touch, my taste, and my vision. And I believe that using actively our senses helps form the sixth sense, which is intuition, knowledge, memory. In your case, empathy, that you were able to see these children walking behind the privileged children and identify those children through your senses, basically. You saw, you smelled, perhaps, you could touch. And I'm very concerned that the seduction of technology that has taken hold means that everything is virtual. People want to create, I don't even know what it's called, VR, virtual reality. I don't want that. I want reality. I want to see a tiger. I want to hear the sound when I come visit you in Nepal, as I will. I want to hear everything. I want to hear the language. I want to hear the water. I know that it's, the mountains, the Himalayas, the smell of the air must be very different. The amount of oxygen in the air must have a very different feeling to me than living at the ocean as I do. All of that is a phenomenal thrill. And I believe this is what is going to get civilization forward, is not our technology, but our humanity and our ability to use ourselves the way when we observe animals, they rely on their senses because no one's told them how to, use an iPad. How do you feel about this, what I call the seduction of technology?
I absolutely believe in what you just said. Not only that, actually, we often, among our circles, and especially during lectures, I often bring this because I'm a big advocate of doing things by hand as well. And not only that, it's more like using all your senses. Is, like, you'll find me repeatedly, using this line as an advocate, almost. Let me explain this, because this concept, gets better explained with this, I don't know, analogy, if I can call that. Wherever I go, like, I've like it can be Malaysia, it can be Taiwan. I travel a lot. Well, not as much as I used to, but or would like to. But like, during my time, I've interacted with young people from different parts of the world, and in some of the very competitive and technologically more advanced part of the world, one thing that I've noticed is the depression rate is really high. And again, like, I might be just talking out of the blue, because there's, again, if somebody asks for the science behind it and data and this and that, I might not be able to, but just my common sense, again, using my own senses with what I've heard, with what I've smelled, kind of, I've in my interaction with these young people, and my own observation tells me that there's something that dies. There's something that stops functioning when you rely so much on, when you don't let your senses get activated, and like, let your soul be nurtured. I mean, it sounds all wishy-washy, but then we all know what it is. Like, you know what I'm talking about, right?
It's fundamental. It's essential. It's who we are.
It is. And one thing and this is something that really hit me around, I think it was around 2012, particularly during my trip to Taiwan. There was this school, I will not mention the name, but then there was this school where basically this girls' school, and they bring top girls from all the schools, from all across the country to this school, and then basically they're pitted against each other. So you can imagine, like, the top girls from other schools are brought to this, so they are like best of the best, and it's just so competitive. And I was really, and these are amazing girls, like girls that they're like early, like junior high school, but then talking about foreign affairs and this and that, and the most advanced technological thing that basically I used to just get lost, like, within that level of talent. And in a couple of years, of like, of course, once I get connected to someone, then it tends to go lifelong. Of course, there's not enough time to constantly keep in touch, but then once in a couple of years, like, I tend to keep that alive. And just a couple of years down the line, I saw many of them, amazingly brilliant minded young girls, just basically lost. They've just given up. And that was, like, when I talked to teachers and other, my friends back in Taiwan, it's not just one-off thing. It has become a trend. And we started talking to some parents as well, in a few gatherings. And one of the things that I always mention, that's why I love talking to parents. It doesn't matter, the age difference, that's irrelevant. I love talking to parents because the new generation is our hope, for the planet, for humanity, whatever you want to call it. And if they don't fare well, if they don't do well, then where's the hope? The reason of hope, one of the major reason of hope is the youth. And if that somehow just dies, it goes, into apathy or despair, depression of that kind, then we cannot hold any hope for the future. And one thing that I always mention as analogy is talk about animals, right? That's what I do best. You will never find any animal in the jungle committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
humanity is unique in that regard. In, you know, like its jungle, which is the open society, you know, humans tend to commit suicide. But it might be, again, my limited knowledge, but to my limited knowledge, I do not know of any real indigenous community, that has been unaltered or, you know, like unadulterated, or, you know, like no foreign intervention to that extent. You will not hear of any suicides. At least I haven't. But as soon as, and you will see like really high rates of suicide among indigenous people who have been either translocated, evicted, their lifestyle, their traditional, you know, the indigeneity dies, then they kill themselves. They start killing themselves.
Like the first peoples, Native Americans in the United States, unfortunately.
Alcoholism goes really high. Drug abuse, substance abuse, you know, those kind of things, you know, gets really high. And this is universal. You know, Native Americans, Orang Asli in Malaysia, you know, some Raute communities here. A very good friend of mine just came back from, you know, a trip to Western Nepal, where we have the last nomadic, you know, jungle people called Rautes. Only 144 of them remaining now, because they've been, you know, like settled down. Many of them have been settled down, and alcoholism is rife there. You know, it's just like a pandemic. That is what happens when we, you know, when we are detached from that privilege. If I can, you know, say that in this context, actually, it comes down to be a privilege to be able to use our senses. That is the biggest gift. That is how we're designed. And that is, and you cannot take that away from humanity. You know, like, of course you can go on, you know, your technological advancement to whatever extent you want to go with that, but then you can't change that about humanity. You know, we need to be able to, you know, keep our senses sharp. That is something that has been taken away by the construct of the society and construct of the lifestyle that we have created for our, you know, like newer generations.
But I think it has to be actively taught.
It has to be.
I think somehow just the nature of who I am and always have been, and is that I had a predisposition to using my senses. But I've always been aware of being surrounded by people who just are not taking things in. And that's not a criticism, but I'm just aware that I am more highly attuned, and I'm a listener. I mean, this is the whole music thing, and you and I will talk about music a bit, but it's the intangible, it's the non-literal, it's the information that we absorb as beings.
Yeah.
That I mean, I see it mirrored in certain animals all the time. Animals also, some of them have fear.
Yeah.
They use their senses for that, but they also use it for love. I don't know about tigers and their love lives, but I can speak to elephants, and certainly Jane Goodall and her chimp community. I grew up in a chimp loving household, and as I've said, my mother has adopted a long time ago a chimp, and we have pictures of him and so on. And it's, you know, I'm the second son, the chimp is the first. But no, I'm really vastly concerned about this, because when I travel the world, I see children on devices, and they're not looking around, they're looking at screens. Yeah. And they're not, you know, I always say that there's a huge difference between hearing and listening, and eating and savoring, and seeing and viewing, and touching and feeling. And when that goes, there go the pleasures.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I spoke before about having a plate of momo with you, and I intend to do that. And I want to learn from you about why this particular momo will taste good or not good. And then I'll make you a dish of pasta. The Italians always say, a tavola non si invecchia, you don't get old at the table. In other words, time freezes.
Yeah.
You're being nourished, but you are also sharing. And it's a wonderful concept. And, you know, people gather for meals, they gather for feasts, they gather for experience. But frankly, now it's about very competitive eating. Yeah. And going to the best restaurant or eating the most of this or that. Yeah. It's not about savoring or sharing I'm going to tell you of a concept that maybe you haven't heard of, and then you and I at another point will talk about it, called the slow food movement, which was created in Italy in the 1980s. And I'm one of the original people who worked on it and have remained active through the years.
Wow.
And you could look up slowfood.org. But the concept was that food be available to everyone, that it be clean, safe, affordable, reflect origin, heritage, and so on. That if, for example, there's a particular hen in the city of Padua that has a flavor or goes well with particular recipes there, or an onion in the Bay of Biscay in northern Spain, I can name thousands of these things. And the man who created it is called Carlo Petrini, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Peace. He calls it the Ark of Taste, as in Noah's Ark, that we need to save, like the animals, we need to save these food products that reflect heritage and tradition and custom and sentimentality and love and sex and everything. All is a part of this. And frankly, by eating the local fish, now everyone talks about local and seasonal. This was a long time ago. This concept of slow food being opposed to fast food.
Fast food, yeah.
That you sit down, you savor, that my hamburger that I would eat at a McDonald's in Oslo, Norway, not be the same as the one I eat in Tokyo or Louisiana, that everything be different, and that something have a local flavor, because otherwise, why go somewhere else to discover something? I want people to come to New York and discover our local foods. People don't think we have agriculture around New York City. We do.
Yeah.
And we have oceans and lakes and rivers and so on. And this is, plus the fact that we have people from all over the world, so that I can go to a Nepali restaurant in Queens and Jackson Heights. I don't know if you've been, but there is one, and eat Nepali food. That's because we have the United Nations here, and there are communities from literally every nation in the world.
Yeah.
And that's the exciting thing about, one of the exciting things about New York City. But children are separated from that. They basically want to do what other kids do and have what other kids have. And I see this as a shift that I worry desperately about. That, you know, globalization, call it what you will, the fact of having a standardization and a similarity, meaning that a sweater or shirt produced in Bangladesh is available anywhere in the world. But so what, frankly? Yes, we want to promote commerce, but we must maintain culture, traditions. I'm not conservative, believe me. I mean, it's very interesting to me that the first word I used about you was conservationist. And in the United States, the early conservationists were also called conservative because they wanted to conserve what there was. And I'm a believer in that, but you also use the word progressive, and I'm definitely of that school. But I think that language can evolve to become something that can be used as a cultural, cudgel, 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 to destroy and to separate.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't use terms that are sort of vastly heard. When people say it's common sense, what common sense might be to you and me may not be common sense at all to someone else. And we're not necessarily correct. That other person might be correct. But I think what I'm driving at is, what is it that can unify us in the world, all of us, without the obliteration of what makes us different?
Well, I think, you know, like bringing people together, like I share your concern as well. You know, if I'm not wrong in, you know, understanding, you know, what you called your desperate concern was the homogenization is in my eyes is a curse. Like every single city in the world, if it started looking exactly the same, with exactly the similar kind of things available, the world would be a boring place to live in. The world would be a very boring place to live in, like the life of a chimp in captivity, for example. The way, again, bringing back to the suicidal tendencies of when the senses don't get, imagine back in those colonial era, dark for various reasons, but then that exploration, the sense of exploration, the thrill of being in a new place, the thrill of seeing finding a new fruit, that I am a big guy in that front. Fruits, wild fruits particularly. If there's something that I didn't know about, I just take the time, the smell of it, the taste of it. It just, excites me beyond. And vegetable as well. If there's any vegetable that, I love hanging out in a big, fresh food market, well, vegetable market or fruit market, or, fish, because of my, I just love watching them, because of my fascination for the animal. And then you get to see, it's like visiting a zoo. I mean, it's sad and grim because they're dead, but it's still fascinating. And and that we're basically homogenizing again. I'm not against, like you said. I didn't know I would feel that need to justify, but then or to explain. But yeah, it does sound like I'm against learning, because once you've learned it all, then then nothing is left for more thrill of that sort. But then the kind of homogenizing is something that I'm not a big fan of. I don't have a very clear a straightforward answer to what could be the way to bring the world closer without killing that sense of diversity. Keep things as they are, to the extent they can be functional. Again, someone doesn't have to be under in subordinate conditions or substandards for to be different, but that essence cannot be killed, or that it cannot, and everything cannot be bastardized, and that kind of fusion can be amazing. Fusion can be amazing in its in its own way. And I'm not an advocate of everything to be kept in its classical form alone, but that too much of mixing up and normalization, of then I think that cuts out the thrill and kills the thrill, makes it too easy. Again, I think that is robbing off of the sensory pleasures that we talked about earlier.
We have an expression here: everything old is new again.
As well.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was saying that we have an expression here: everything old is new again, which means that if I discover a song from West Virginia or from Madras in India or somewhere that's old, but it's new to me.
Yeah.
So therefore, I believe in learning. Obviously, that goes without saying. But one of my other heroes, Michelangelo, when he was designing something on a sheet of paper at the age of 82, wrote down "ancora imparo," I'm still learning.
Oh yeah.
And that to me is part of the fundamental. Is that we were talking before about early education for children. That is crucial. But I believe in lifelong learning and teaching and sharing. When you said that at Oxford, someone said to you, you should be teaching, not studying, I understand that conundrum. There are things that I can teach, but there's so much that I want to learn that I try to block time just for learning. Again, not getting in too deep into something, but I think it's important. Religions of the world dictate cultural mores. You were talking before about the girls in Taiwan, and I wondered whether the fact that they are women held them back because they're women and the expectation of women in society. I don't know Taiwan, I've not been there, but around the world, there are religions that dictate practices. And there are religions, for example, that involve the killing of animals at certain times, or the way the animals should be killed. There are other religions that if you step on a cockroach, that's a terrible thing. And, it's a huge topic, but I guess my main question is the degree to which we can promote equality and availability and access mindful, I don't want to say for or against, but mindful, cognizant of religious dictates in society. Right now, we're seeing in Iran young women, I believe, justifiably protesting against what the dictates are of the religion that governs much of that society. But let's bring it back to accessibility, but also animals and their rights in a world of religions.
Religion for me, in my own personal understanding, I have a like a slightly different take of what I personally believe in a religion to be. The way religion is practiced, like you give an example of Iran and what's going on at the moment with the hijab and this and that and all the taboo. That's culture, that's culture as a practice. The way religions are practiced most of the times, the visible aspect of religious practices, in my view, there's just culture, and cultures have the entire evolutionary trend and process that they have. There's a reason why they have evolved to be that way. There could be multiple factors. Some could be like slow process. Others could be more like mutation. Like events or some kind of crisis or something like that. But then they're merely cultures. Religion in themselves, you will never find any like fundamental problem. Of course, there can be different kind of interpretations of how you see this, the dogma, the narratives, the discourses, and the sects within the religion, same religion even. And like it can be so so many different dimensions to that brings all these like conflicting and contradicting doctrines from within the same, even like Buddhism, for example. Like so many different kind of the school of thoughts and a school of Buddhism in block manner and then in minute details as well. I think they're all branched out like that because the practicing, because it basically religion is nothing but the pursuance of the spirituality, I think. But then the quest of it, like how do you achieve it, how do you attain it? For some it was about the intangible, like you said. I will borrow your word of the day. I love that. But then for others, they couldn't reach out that deep to the intangible, and it became the copy of what was visible. We have a saying in Nepalese that we have this ritualistic commemorating your or remembering your ancient, like your father who have already passed on, right? So my father still does that once every year, once for his father and once for his mother, who passed away, and that's called Shraddha. That ritual is called Shraddha. That day is called Shraddha. And the story is about, there was this cat, that was like a house cat that was out in loose. And of course, Shraddha involves a lot of milk related items. You make lots of food, no meat or anything like that. It's all PS food, we call it. And so someone actually covered that cat with a basket and put something heavy on the top because, it did, for practical reasons, right? For obvious practical reasons. But it just happened to be that whoever was, witnessing that, the next generation, when it was his turn, he actually mobilized people to go around, find the cat, and then, brought the cat, covered it with a basket, and it became a trend. So for many people, it can be, I mean, you see those kind of things happening all the time anyways, when you do things for the sake of like tick the box kind of thing, there's no soul, there's no real depth in, or the pursuance of the meaning behind why do this, and many people tend to do things in a repetitious, in a repetitious manner.
I think maybe I lost something, but what is the significance of covering the cat relating to remembering the ancestors?
Nothing. That's the whole
Oh,
point.
okay. Okay.
So basically, it was done for the for the practical reason, so that the cat
Because
doesn't
it's
go
always done.
yeah,
Okay.
and then steal the milk or just touch anything, because
I see.
there's this sacredness into what you were doing. You have to take a bath, and then everything has to be fresh. Everything has to be like untouched by any like no contamination basically. And then
I see.
if the cat is allowed to go in and lick the milk, then basically it's over. You have to find a whole
I
another set of
understand.
milk. So
Yeah.
for the very obvious practical reason, someone did that,
Mhm.
but but someone else's mind was working in a very visible term. They was not seeking the meaning behind that, the logic behind that, but they thought because everything else they copy, right? Everything else they copy, and I see a lot of that in religious practices, that there's this mindlessness, like what made sense 2000 years ago in a very cultural setup. Like it could be need of that hour, the way women dressed, maybe there was a reason, maybe there was a logic behind that, and maybe it
Or
was
the way
scientific.
animals were killed in part for the
Exactly.
survival of the humans eating those
Absolutely,
animals. Yeah.
absolutely. And then
Yeah.
like now we've stopped looking into the meaning behind it, because every single reason, every single religion, as far as my knowledge goes, talks about compassion. I think compassion is key ingredient of pretty much every. Thou shalt not kill. Thou should like not be jealous of others. Don't harm others. Do no harm is basically the essence of all, pretty much every single religion that I'm aware of, at least.
Yeah.
I might my knowledge might be limited, but then why else like that bottom line dogma gets compromised all the time, again in the name of religion. It is simply misunderstanding and like a misinterpreted practice, which is culture basically,
So
in
this
my
brings me
sense.
back the sense of compassion but also everything we've been talking about to our very first topic today, is how do we coexist with the natural world? How do we coexist with animals who have their own ways, their own practices, their own instincts? We in New York have seen coyotes walk in Central Park because they're losing their habitats outside of the city, and they walk over the bridge into New York City, believe it or not. And all over the world, we have seen either animals marginalized and therefore dying by losing their habitats, or entering the human space. And how do we're losing species every day. And with that goes culture, tradition, biodiversity, what nature intended. I can tell you that because I'm a big traveler, but I've not traveled in the past 2.5 years because of the pandemic and so on. And in the early phases of the pandemic, when New York City was not moving at all, I could hear birds outside my window. I could hear them in a way that I'd never heard them before,
Yeah.
dialoguing, singing, each with their own song. I felt I was in a forest,
Yeah.
and I'm in Manhattan.
Yeah.
And that was such a thrilling experience, but also a reminder that they're in our space. That's fine. But, it's the big question, and I think it's a central concern of yours, is how do we conserve all the residents and the species of the planet? I look at plants and I see the potential for curing illnesses. If we destroy the plant, if we destroy the habitat, perhaps we're losing a cure for cancer or Alzheimer's or any number of things.
Well, that is the question of the like the upcoming decade, I think, at least. And it has been a question for like it is a question that will dominate the century as well, I believe, because in one hand, I think it is getting more and more obvious than ever before that the compromise with the natural integrity of our planet is this most stupid thing one can do. And the repercussions, the consequences are very visible now. Like something that used to be a concept now is a visible idea. People can see that. So you mess with it, then it messes with you back. And that is what is I think a reinforcing, humanity. I think that is really lately even more so, has been reinforcing that idea within humanity, and that will gain prominence in the years to come. Of course, it's very difficult sometimes to have that kind of faith in humanity, because we've seen how much thick-headed humanity can be, and like never learning tendencies that that we have seen over past centuries and even millennia in many regards about humanity. But then at the same time, we can't lose hope. Talking about this is one planet with one habitat for all of us. So I'm a big believer of one welfare, one health. You conserve them, you conserve yourself, so it's all one conservation as well. But then while we're in the quest, I think I see the troubles about, take wolves, for example. Wolves were almost wiped out, and then they were reintroduced in certain places, but then the lack of tolerance among people, farmers, local farmers in the US. This is something that I bring quite often, in our own case, that the developed countries, when they go, advocating, agencies from developed countries as well, donating or advocating about the need for conservation, pushing agendas like double the tigers within the next 10 years kind of ideas. And then there's this amazing example, this loud testimony in the States, where one calf gets killed by a wolf, and then the entire population that was recently reintroduced because they are about to be extinct, gets annihilated. The entire population, reintroduced population, someone just goes and shoots them because there's no tolerance. Here in the one end of the universe where people are destitute, like we talked about, there's no social security. There's no kind of just imagine any sort of safety net in any kind of privilege. Take that away. Those are the kind of people living in really harsh conditions up in the mountains, and the snow leopard comes and basically just kills 40 goats in one night, 60 goats and 80 goats sometimes in one night. And we are working on insurance for those goats up here in the Himalayas, so inaccessible, so far away, so remote, so much poverty in the country, in general, resourcelessness. There are so many priorities for the government, and still, we are working on insurance for the goats, for the farmers up in the Himalayas. I mean, what's wrong with the United States government? Couldn't it come up with some kind of? So I think it's just about the perspective. Now, all this understanding that we're being face to face with, if we are willing to see, or look at it, that is, then basically there's a serious need. It is the serious need of the hour to make it available for everybody as perspective, to share this, that it will fall. The idea that it's going to fall on our head if we are not careful enough, and if we do not right the wrong that we have continued with for so long, and hence on all this mess that our planet is in. If we can do that, then the tolerance, you will be amazed, Fred, if you see some farmers here who have got not much, just tiny little piece of land, this little shack for a house, and then elephants come. They have to just keep themselves up all night to guard. And this is the season, actually. This is now the paddy season, right before harvest. And people in Verdi are busy, basically, screaming all night long, just banging tin drums, and just chasing elephants with fire torches and whatnot. And still, if you ask them, and of course they will lose, they will lose some bit of paddy every single night, because these are massive, wild tuskers. You can't easily ward them off. And next day you ask them, so you lost some of your crop, and yeah, what are you going to do? The attitude, the people who are the most destitute, got barely anything. They cannot manage with that, farm production throughout the rest of the year. And even from that was robbed by the elephant, and still the attitude is not that harsh. And yeah. I think the answer is somewhere there, like that's the DNA, that's the human compassion DNA, the human empathy DNA. They understand, they can make sense of that. Where do they go? It has always been their route. And of course, they're greedy,
I realize a couple of many things. When you talk, you set off all kinds of ideas in my head. But just two very quickly, my country, which I love, the United States, we have what's called the can-do spirit. In other words, if there's a problem, we can face it and we can resolve it. I'm not sure, it's a wonderful attitude, and I like to practice that, but not when you come to catastrophic solutions. When I was a boy, if you've ever read the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, if you haven't, that's the book you have to read right now. That was the most influential book of my childhood about the world. And she was writing about this in the early 1960s, about what happens if the spring doesn't come because of environmental disaster. It's a magnificent book. And, but we in the United States have destroyed things with our can-do spirit. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we're talking about animals, and maybe we need to say that there are two categories. There are domesticated animals that live with humans and serve us, and we are expected to treat them well, like goats who give their milk and other things, their coats and so on. And then there are wild animals. So the elephant, unless it happens to be a rare domesticated elephant, the elephant or the tiger goes where they want. The monkey always does what he wants, even though he's very interactive and 98% human. It's those other two that give him wonderful monkey qualities. But they form families, they have compassion, they are teachers. And we can see this among wild animals in their communities. But I think when I was speaking to you before about wild animals, the birds that fly past here in New York City on their very long migrations to South America and then up to Canada are wild animals. They don't particularly represent harm to us here, but we, I believe, have to help protect them in a way that gives them their space and their identity, and that we don't denature them, but also protect human life and protect the planet.
Yeah,
that's a lot for us to tackle in the few minutes we have left.
And well, I mean, the bottom line here, Fred, is we've come a little too far, for this entire, situation to be that easy enough to be resolved in a snap of finger. Of course, there's no silver bullet. What we deal here with, like Nepal is very, very interesting for that matter, because it's in the heart of South Asia. South Asia has always been, as far as you want to go in the timeline of, history of humanity, of civilization, 14,000 years ago, South Asia was always the most populous, highly densely populous, geographical area in the entire globe. And so we have always been this, not this, but we've always been the most densely populated area. And now, even more so, obviously, the population boom explosion, because the resourceful humanity got, the more, it's a highly successfully breeding species.
Yeah.
And that has become a serious trouble. And in our case, especially in Nepal is 54 times smaller than Australia. Mm-hmm. And yet the population is a solid few million more than Australia, right? So population is definitely a problem. And why do we need this population vitality? Because it's crucial for economy otherwise, and economy or other functions as well. But then primarily because of economy, and humanity has lacked that discipline, primarily because they did not know back then, but now we do. And if there were not so much pressing situation because of war and because of ego and because of supremacy issues between countries and this and that, then I believe humanity would find this chance to really sit together, bring the best minds, and then figure out a way, a humane way, compassionate way for humanity and for our wild cousins, to at least an optimum. It's always going to be a trade-off, but then to somehow figure out a way to give them some space, and most sustainably. Again, we have to resort, like you started beautifully with the reasons for hope. And again, like use the technology not to, further ruin, because, we have so far used the technology to ruin only, talk about the nuclear war looming. But then the same technology, could be, it can be, and we have seen that as well, like for one of, like most pressing challenges in the world, the technology has been the answer. And then the human brain, the compassion, the empathy, these are assets. These are now in our current society, these have started getting a secondary delegated meaning as weakness, but these have always been our asset, and these are going to save us, if anything, because if we don't show compassion to the rest, conservation for me, Fred, is about balance. Balance is the word, and that is why I said, like the way you interpreted conservation earlier, you talk about agriculture as well. Nobody does that. That's why we're facing problems.
Oh, I do. It's central. Yeah.
That's why we're facing problem with the tigers here, because they wanted to double. It was completely arbitrary number. Who came up with that number? And we're talking about 13 different countries. We're not homogeneous places. We're talking about Siberia and Nepal. Siberia is vast wilderness. Here in Nepal, there's tiger habitat. There's human settlement right there within 1 kilometer stretch. That's the kind of scenario we're dealing with. And mindless conservationists, I don't consider them conservationists, because there was no conservation. That was anti-conservation, if anything. That's just mindlessly doubling the number of tigers. And when for that, they pumped water in the, like created water holes where there were no water previously. The marginal land, which had its ecological significance. The population is environmentally determined, because of the availability of the natural resources. And you meddle with that, play God, and you basically just not only doubled in Berdia. In the past 11 years, the tiger population went 7 times more. And obviously, you're going to create troubles, between those two species, humanity and tigers, because, like you said, tigers are wild animals. They will want to go wherever they want to go. And then, the chances that they will mistake 1 or 2 human beings for a deer or something like that are fairly high, in that kind of tight scenario. So again, the answer is not press your own agenda. I really do not agree with the kind of conservationist or activists, for that matter, who forget about others' perspectives. Like lately in my life, I have come up with this, like I'm working with my colleague actually to make it a thing, perspective-based learning. Like yesterday I was asked by another friend, a journalist friend of mine, what is truth? There's no truth, because if you believed this is the truth, then you become next Hitler, basically, because, and that absolutism, that absolute faith or belief in something without a second doubt, that is where the perspective comes really handy. Then you get a 360-degree surround perspective, surround idea about, what others might, if I see a cup here, I might be seeing horse's tail on this side, but you might be seeing horse's head on the other side that I cannot see from here. And we could just argue and fight for the rest of our lives. Or I could accept your perspective, and then I could, and then I could make you accept my perspective, and then both their perspective put together would complete what the cup actually is like. It's like the 9 blind people and the elephant. One feels the leg and says elephant is like a pillar. The other feels the ears, the flaps, and then calls it like a fan. They were all right, but then that's not the complete description. So if you put everybody's perspectives, and that is what conservationists are missing, that is what the economists are missing, that is what the politicians are missing. Everybody's lobbying for their own agenda without wanting to hear. And if you push linear agendas, and that basically disrupts that balance. And that is what I'm trying to make people understand, that like if you're a conservationist, don't go for increasing the number of animals. That is not conservation. Talk about balance. In everything, conservation is about sustainability and balance. That is one thing that nature teaches us. That applies in everything, everything in this universe, physical, metaphysical, you name it, like ecological, economic. Balance is the key word. Recession, inflation, depression, balance. You push one in one direction a little too much, then you're going to fail on the other side. So basically, if we can somehow pull towards, again, it's going to be a trade-off, it's going to be very difficult, but again, if there was one line of answer, like pull this together as close as possible, and then we might have a fair chance to live in harmony with the rest of our wild cousins. that's the only chance for humanity. That's how I see it.
I'm going to introduce one more topic, though I know you and I could basically take this on the road all over the world. I'm a conservationist also in terms of the arts. And that's my central operating principle, though I believe in sustainability and everything we've discussed. But I believe that the missing element that can help everything else work is the arts. In the United States, we have what's called the STEM curriculum: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I call it the STEAM and put in the letter A for arts, because doctors and scientists who have an artistic sensibility are more inclined to be creative in what they produce and how they reason and how they face a virus, for example. We don't, when we look back on civilizations, look back at the military leaders too much. We look back at the artists, and we look back to ancient Greece and Egypt and all over the world for information about their societies through what the artists tell us. And it's poetry that captures that essence of the human spirit and emotion. It is poetry set to music that becomes song literature, lieder, art songs, folk songs that tell us who we are, and the music expresses the words in a different way. Opera to me is the most gigantic and wonderful mirror of the human nature and society behavior, and that's why opera is my main thing. Classical music, which is to say music that may not have words attached to it, or even the name of a symphony. If Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6 is called the Pathétique, we think of it as being pathos, pathetic. But if I were to refer to someone's Symphony No. 2 without a word, then it's purely music, it's sound, it's not definable in our language, and is experienced by each one of us together. When you talk about perspective, if we were to sit in a room with 500 people and hear the same piece of music, there would be 500 perspectives on that same piece of music.
Absolutely.
And all of them are correct. And visual arts is a different thing. It's information. It is the opinion of the creator transported to a wall, to a screen, to a canvas, to a film, if we're going in that direction. Performing arts theater is the gathering of people, as they did in ancient Greece, to address ideas and the human nature. Psychology, all of that is embedded there. It's something that we can do that the animals don't do too much of. We've seen monkeys paint a little bit, but that's not too much. But part of the reason that I've chosen to live my life in the world of art is not because I'm a dilettante, but because I believe that this really is the answer to everything else. And when writers write about nature, when painters paint the natural environment, when you can have Schubert do a song about a trout and you can hear the trout swimming. When I created a small list that will accompany this particular broadcast of works of art, but one of the greatest works of all is Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen, which is about the creation and destruction and the rebirth of the world in the natural environment, and how man and woman, but especially man in this case, destroys the environment, and how women save and regenerate the environment. It's a magnificent work of art. And we can go to it, see it, hear it repeatedly, and understand who we are. It's that mirror. The common language that we have, you speak beautiful English, but the common language that we have is that musical notation was invented in Italy by a monk named Guido d'Arezzo. And someone can sit down anywhere in the world and read musical notation and share that language. We may not speak the same language in terms of our spoken language, but that language is there. And the music can unite us. And we don't necessarily need the words attached to the music. I love that too. But when I hear a folk melody played on an instrument that's been created thousands of years ago, I hear antiquity. I connect to that person all the way back there who created that instrument, whether it's something you blow in or pluck or beat on or whatever. That's the human beating heart, and it's in music.
Absolutely.
And so I want to see you again somewhere in our world and
Absolutely.
know what you're doing and share music with you. And you have so much to teach, I can tell that. Gautama, the one with the most light, is your perfect name. And it's really been an honor to
I'm just a
meet
student like anybody else.
you.
We're learning.
Yeah.
And then we impart, we share, what we have learned, and how we see, we share our perspectives. That's all I have to say. Yeah.
So it's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely.
Manoj, thank you. Really, how do you say thank you in your Nepali language?
It's called Dhanyabad.
Dhanyabad.
Not bad, yeah.
Dhanyabad.
Yeah.
That's what I say to you is Dhanyabad. And
which is welcome.
I want people to, I hope they've learned. I'm going to share this video. I know you can. And take so much to think about, and think about how we can make the world better through conservation, through sacrifice, through kindness, and through art. And good luck.
Thank you. I try my bit.
You're doing a terrific job. It's very inspiring. You're doing a terrific job.
So much, Brad. No, this was really amazing. To be able to have a chat with you like this, and I very much look forward to catching up with you in New York,
or Oxford, perhaps.
And you should come.
There's something I want listeners to know about. I want you to know about, that I'm a member of, called the Oxford Cultural Collective. That really is the OCC. It's really about everything we discussed today in diverse ways. And I'm what's known in Britain as a trustee, in America as a patron. No, the other way. Patron there, trustee here. Someone who supports it and gives my input and guidance. It's a wonderful organization, Oxford Cultural Collective, that was founded in Oxford by a gentleman named Donald Sloan, but has now taken on a worldwide flavor and promotion of many of the things that we discussed. So
super.
More to come. My best to you and your family.
Thank you.
Thank you.